Statistics Study Guide, StatCrunch by Madison Weiss. What is StatCrunch? StatCrunch is a website used in statistics class as a graphing calculator. It is similar to Excel with the functions it can carry out, such as using a spreadsheet, calculating formulas, and graphing. Students rely on this resource to help them with their work. How to access StatCrunch. First, we're going to log on to the Hawaii Pacific University portal and go into Blackboard. Then we're going to go to Courses and log in through Pearson. Next, there is a tab in Pearson with StatCrunch and access to the website. What features does StatCrunch have? You can input data into the spreadsheet in order to do calculations like finding the mean and standard deviation, correlation coefficient, regression lines, and coefficient of determination, contingency tables, confidence intervals using data, hypothesis testing with data, and t-statistic testing using data, or inputting data into specific generators to receive answers, like probabilities in uniform, normal, or binomial distribution, computing confidence intervals using summary, hypothesis testing, z-statistics testing, and t-statistics testing. It can also graph answers as histograms, Pareto charts, bar graphs, scatter plots, pie charts, box plots, dot plots, and stem and leaves. Graphing. First, I'm showing you how to access other datasets on the StatCrunch website. You go to the StatCrunch homepage, click Datasets, and look up datasets that you want to find. A histogram is a type of bar graph without spaces between the columns. It represents numerical data and is often used to picture major features of the distribution of data in convenient form. It does not show trends over time. To create a histogram on StatCrunch, we go to Graph Histogram, select the column, and hit Compute. A bar graph is similar to a histogram, except it has spaces between the columns and represents categorical data instead, typically used to compare data between different groups or track changes that occur over time. To create a bar graph on StatCrunch, we go to Graph, Bar Graph, select the column we like to use, and hit Compute. A Pareto chart is a bar graph that orders the categories from largest to smallest frequency, in other words, times the data was observed, usually representing in categories, and is used to analyze data and defect data for further comprehension of improvement. To create a Pareto chart, we go to Graph, Bar Graph, select the column, and click Count Descending instead. A pie chart is a circle cut into slices to represent the proportional frequency of the outcome it represents, usually categorical data. It can be used to show percentages of a whole and percentages in a set point in time. It can't show changes over time. To create a pie chart, we go to Graph Pie Chart with Data and select the column we like to test and hit Compute. A box plot is a graph that demonstrates the spread and skewness of numerical data through their quartiles and usually represents numerical data. It's used to show distributions of numeric data values, especially useful for comparing multiple groups, and is a visual representation of the 5-number summary, aka minimum first quartile, median third quartile, and the maximum. To create a box plot, we go to Graph Box Plot, select the column we like to use, and hit Compute. We can also switch it to horizontal view to make it easier to see. A dot plot is a chart containing a dot for each data value and typically represents numerical data. It's normally used to display the distribution of samples in relatively small datasets. To create a dot plot, we go to Graph, Dot Plot, select the column we like to use, and hit Compute. A scatter plot is a plot which uses coordinates to display values for a dataset with two variables, usually representing numerical data. It's used to view the two variables' relationship, evaluating if it's positive or negative correlation. In order to create a scatter plot, we go to Graph, Scatter Plot, select the columns we would like to use, and then hit Compute. For a stem and leaf chart, it represents numerical data and typically used to organize data as it's collected. The stem is a number before the last digit, and the leaf is a number in the ones value. To create a stem and leaf chart, we go to Graph, Stem and Leaf, and select a column and hit Compute. Calculating with data. Mean and standard deviation. The mean describes a more accurate balancing point for distribution than the median. It's also known as the average or expected value. The standard deviation describes the typical distance from observations from the mean. The value of the standard deviation is always constant. In order to find the mean and standard deviation, we go to Stats, Summary Stats, Columns, and select the columns we would like to use. We also hold down Shift to select multiple columns. We then hit Compute. We do need to use data in order to find this information. Correlation coefficient, regression line, and coefficient of determination. The correlation coefficient measures the strength and direction of the linear association between two variables. The more linear the points are, the stronger the relationship. If the points are increasing, it is positive in direction, while if the points are decreasing, it is negative in direction. The regression line is referred to as the best fit line for the data on the scatter plot, representing the relationship between the two variables in the scatter plot. It is used to mimic the trend of data even though it doesn't pass through each point. The coefficient of determination measures how well the statistical model represents the outcome, lowest value being 0 and highest being 1. In order to find all three of these values, we go to Stat, Regression, Simple Linear, and then select the columns we would like to use. We will be needing to use a data set in order to do this. Here we have the equation for the line of best fit. Right underneath are the values for correlation coefficient and correlation of determination. If you click the arrow to the right, you'll see a graph with the line of best fit. Contingency table is a type of table that displays the frequency distribution of variables in rows and columns, normally used to understand the relationship between categorical variables, used in survey research, business intelligence, and scientific research. For this model, we are going to use a worksheet to help us with our answers. First, we are going to go to Stat, then Tables, and click on Contingency with Data. Then we are going to select the variables that we would like to find and click Compute. The confidence interval for population proportion are points where the unknown population are likely to lie. 95% of these intervals will successfully contain the population proportion and 5% will not. It indicates how reliable the research is and uses data in order to find results. To find the confidence interval, we will go to Stat, Proportion Stat, One Sample, and With Data, then select the column we are going to use. Then we are going to click on the confidence interval button to make sure that it is being computed there. Hypothesis testing tests for an alternative hypothesis that we hope is true compared to the null hypothesis, which is what we already know. The null hypothesis is always set equal to the possibility. Instead, the alternative hypothesis uses symbols such as unequal to, greater than, and less than. The p-value of the hypothesis is tested against its significance in order to see if we reject or fail to reject the hypothesis, and uses data in order to find results. For hypothesis testing, we are going to use a one-sample hypothesis test question that we did in class. First, when we go to StatCrunch, we will go to Stat, Proportion Stat, One Sample with Data, and hit the column we would like to use with the number of successes. Then we hit Compute. The t-statistic measures the size of the difference relative to the variation in the sample data. It determines whether to support or reject the null hypothesis. The greater the magnitude of t, the greater the evidence against the null hypothesis, meaning we fail to reject. Used when the sample size is small or the population standard deviation is unknown, and uses data in order to find results. We're going to be using another worksheet and copy and pasting the data into the spreadsheet. Then we are going to hit Stat, T-Stat, One Sample with Data, select the column, and change the hypothesis, and hit Compute for our results. Next, we're going to do a t-statistic paired testing and copying and pasting the information into our StatCrunch spreadsheet. Then we are going to hit Stat, T-Stat, Paired, and select the columns that we would like to use, and then hit Compute. Calculating without data. Probabilities in uniform, normal, and binomial distribution. Uniform distribution is a symmetric probability distribution where all the outcomes have an equal likelihood of occurring, used when all values have a constant probability. Normal distribution represents the distribution of many random samples as a symmetrical bell-shaped graph about the mean, used with the mean and standard deviation, also known as a Poisson distribution. Binomial distribution is a frequency distribution of the possible number of successful outcomes in each number of trials where there is the same possibility of success, used when there are only two possible outcomes. First, we're going to be using a worksheet to help us work on the uniform distribution example. And now we're highlighting the important information that we need. Then we're going to Stats, Calculators, Uniforms, and typing in the information, then hitting Compute to get our results. Next, we are going to be doing a normal distribution, and we are also going to be using the same worksheet but a different problem to help us get the results. Then we're going to type in the information that we need into the calculator and hit compute for our answers. Last but not least, we are going to be using another worksheet to help us with the binomial distribution, again highlighting the important information that we will need to help solve the problem. Now we'll go to Stat, Calculator, Binomial, and enter in the information, then hitting compute in order to find the result. The concept of the confidence interval is the same as we used before, however, we are using a summary instead of data. We're going to be using another worksheet to help us with the confidence interval. Here we are gathering the information for our summary. Then we are going to go into StatCrunch and Stat, Proportion Stats, one sample with summary, and type in the number of successes and observations, then hitting confidence interval and compute. However, if you go to Stat, Proportion Stat, 2 sample with summary, we can do a 2 sample test on confidence intervals using the summary, which is where we compare two different observations. And here we are looking at the example we are using in order to find the information that we need. Hypothesis testing also has the same concepts, instead we are using summary instead of data. We are going to be looking at another word problem in order to help us solve for hypothesis testing with summary. We are highlighting the information that we will find useful and then going to Stat, Proportion Stats, one sample with summary, typing in the number of successes and observations, and changing the hypothesis and hitting compute for our results. We're also doing a 2 sample hypothesis testing where we go to Stats, Proportion Stats, 2 sample with summary, and type in the information that we need to compute for a 2 sample hypothesis test. The z-statistic test determines the difference between the mean of the sample and the mean of the population when given the information, a hypothesis test following normal distribution, given the population standard deviation unlike t-statistic testing. To do a z-statistic test, we will be using another word problem, highlighting the information that we will be needing in order to complete it. Then we're going to Stat, z-stat, one sample with summary and entering in the information, then hitting compute in order to find our results. Next, we will be doing a 2 sample z-statistic test, highlighting the important information that we will need, then going back to StatCrunch into Stat, z-stat, 2 sample with summary, and entering in the information, then hitting compute for our results. Finally, the t-statistic testing also applies the same concept, instead using the summary. We'll be looking at another word problem in order to help us get the information that we need to do a 1 sample test. We'll go to tstat 1 sample with summary and enter in our data. Then we will hit compute in order to find our answers. Now we are doing a 2 statistic t summary. Then we'll go to tstat 2 sample with summary and type in our information in order to find the answer for the 2-sample t-statistic summary. In summary, StatCrunch is a useful tool used for statistics for graphing and calculating information. It's like Excel spreadsheet in the sense of using a data to graph, but it can use more complex formulas specifically designed for statistics. It's affordable and accessible for students and easy to use.